Hi, and welcome to the Painting with Commentary for the Wizkids Magic the Gathering Borborygmos. This was episode 53 of Paint to Life. If you missed the episode, you should check it out here at the link and hear the story of Borborygmos and the Gruul clan from the plane of Ravnica. So, starting off, we'll go over the paints that I used. The basing paints are as follows. The layer paints are as follows. You can pause this here to see the list if you need. I also used some contrast paints in a contrast medium. There were some dry brush paints, and finally some shades. All Citadel brand with the exception of one, which we will get into. So I'm going to start with Blood Reaver Flesh. I was going to start Borborygmos. He's a Cyclops. I wanted to give him a very human, fleshy kind of color, a little darker than your lighter Caucasian. And of course I have my trusty Airbrush, which is an airbrush. It's an Iwata. An Iwata Eclipse is the model of airbrush that I use. I'm still kind of getting the hang of it, and applying it is kind of new. What I do is I take about 2 dollops of Citadel paint with my paintbrush, put it in the hopper there, and I add about 5 to 6 drops of a Vallejo airbrush thinner and mix it up with a junky paintbrush until it's like you can see in the hopper right there, it looks almost like chocolate milk. You want it to be runny and thick like a good chocolate milk. That's a good consistency. You can see it, well, it passed, but at the beginning when I was working on his thigh, it kind of sprayed out a little too wet. If you're new to using an airbrush, as I am, I'm not going to give you airbrush tips today because I really don't have any for you because I'm still learning. It's mostly about finding that sweet balance where you water down your paint enough with water and thinner so that it goes on smoothly without clogging your needle and clogging your airbrush. And I'm still not quite there. But by slowly building it up, which is the trick, you can see some of that light gray primer coming through in some areas still, which is nice, but it's not the undercolor that I want to come through. I want him to be almost completely this Blood Reaver Flesh color. So I let it dry, I come back at it, I let it dry, come back at it, and now I'm going to add the second mid-tone of the skin, which is Night Quester Flesh. I mix it in right on top of the color that's already in my dropper. As you can see where I'm spraying it, it's lighter, so the high areas I'm spraying, leaving the deeper sections of the muscles and the abs and things. And the underneaths, I don't want to spray them too much because I do want the top parts to stay lighter and the dark parts to stay darker. And there's one more color of flesh I'm going to put in here, which is the next step. But this is obviously the most, I always say start with the inside and work your way out. The skin is the most inside, everything else is worn on top. Cadian flesh tone is the last. Now I'm just going to hit the top parts here with almost like a zenithal. Just the top parts of each muscle, the top parts of each knuckle, of each thigh muscle. I don't know if I overdid it or not. I like the finished product, but is what it is. As I was saying, every piece of clothing he's wearing is on top of this flesh, so keep the flesh on top, and then we'll build up from there. It's okay if you spray on everything else because we're going to fix it. So Dryad Bark is the first color I'm going to lay down for his fur loincloth. It's a really dark brown, and like a couple others in the line, when you paint it, there's not much more that's going to happen to it. Like shade isn't really going to do much to this. You're not going to, you could dry brush it, but you'll have to layer on top of it. It's Dryad Bark. It's like a black brown, and it's definitely the darkest. And I start dark because I want to build it up lighter later, and therefore start dark and work up from there. I actually enjoyed painting this miniature. It was a bit of a journey, and there's a couple things I learned that we're going to get to later in the video about paint replacement and basing. So he's got this weird like organic leafy stuff under his breastplate, and all the source pictures I saw of Borborygmos from the Magic the Gathering game, it looked like vines or ivy. I like Ogren camo, and I just put this on the top part Now, because the skin is all done, and what you see there is finished, really, with my airbrush, different like levels. Be careful, because if you mess up, it's hard to fix. Now we're on to his armor with some XV88. This is an odd, I just call it like the baby poo brown color. But what I use it for is a good base for the contrast paints. Every time I paint a project, I'm falling more and more in love with the contrast paints. I just think they're fun, that you can use one of the 200 Citadel colors that there are, and then using one of the 36 contrast paint over top of it makes a completely different color. And that, it just, it's like fractions, or no, permutations. 36 times 200, that many combinations of paint as opposed to just 236, right? So I'm using it on top of the straps and the top, but not the bottom. I only want the high raised parts in this color, because the bottom part is going to use different contrast. But all these ropey straps are all going to be covered in XV88. And as I was saying before I cut myself off, be careful you don't make any mistakes and touch the flesh, because trying to touch it up now that it's been airbrushed is going to be very difficult. Time to do his beard, I guess, because I really wanted to do that. Squig Orange is the first color. He's got a nice red beard, but also Borborygmos in the lore and in my story, he's older now. So I knew I was going to be doing an aged red beard, as opposed to a straight, bright, brilliant red. And as you know, most gingers are not red like blood red hair. It's got an orange undertone. Definitely red too, but this is his base color. And these hair details on the mini are very deep cut. So I'm just gently applying it to the top of the hair of the hair, not worrying about the insides where the paint isn't yet. See how it's just resting on top? That's okay, we'll get back to it. For now, don't worry about applying it all in one go. We say thin your paints, apply them light, gently. When you're doing fine detail, that's what you want to do, fine detail. You don't want to push so hard to get in all those crevices on your first pass that you accidentally slip your brush and clip his shoulder or his forearm or something that you have to fix. So just take your time and hit the top of the hair, and you can come back later and fill in the dark recessed pieces. And usually when you're putting a wash on, it's going to fill those later anyways, so it's not as big of a deal. It's mostly important you don't make a mess around the edges when you're painting your lines in. So now we're doing his horns. These are Baneblade brown. It's like a nice off brown. It's like a lighter tan. Again, it's just the foundation for a contrast paint I have in mind. And if I used a different base color here for these horns, then the contrast paint would look completely different. So Baneblade brown is a good go-to for an undershade. I wasn't sure about the XV88, but I thought it was going to look nice and leathery. Now he has a couple areas that are going to be steel. Iron Warriors, it's always like my go-to barbarian steel because it's really dark. I find that these guys wouldn't have the best blacksmiths, so it's going to be very dark and full of impurities, and not steel like a paladin on a horse, but like really like junkyard metal. So he's got this bracer, which apparently is just supposed to be shields strummed together, as I learned more about the lore, which I didn't know when I was painting this. It looked to me like barbed wire, like he's got barbed wire wrapped around with bones inside, which I thought was also cool, and that's how I interpreted it instead of shields, like the lore suggests. But Iron Warriors is up for his bracer and his wrist. Now here's the first fun part, Off-White from Vallejo. This is called Vallejo Game Color. I've been looking for Wraithbone for quite a while, and my friendly local gaming store has been out. So I was looking for a separate color that would emulate Wraithbone, and Off-White from Vallejo Game Color was what I found. Color match, it just looks right, it looks just like Wraithbone. Wraithbone is special. It's a base paint by Citadel, and it's supposed to be the paint you put down when you use contrast paints over top of them. But as you see here in this skull, and I'm going to include a couple stills here, the coverage of this paint was not making me happy. This is not the kind of quality I expect from my paints, especially being as used to Citadel as I am. Maybe I'm spoiled. I know Citadel is expensive, but take a look at some of these shots. I don't know if it translates well on camera, but I'll put them here and you can clearly see the coverage is just not really there. It's very blotchy. It looks like you smeared cottage cheese around. So my experience with the game color from Vallejo was not a positive one, and luckily I was able to get some Wraithbone later that week after releasing this episode. So now we're on to Rakarth Flesh. This is going to be for that leather armor. Now there's a bunch of these stone little pieces. I haven't painted them yet because they're above it, and of course I'm going to clip some of my grassy roots. That's okay. But I'm putting this in here again as a base for a contrast paint to make this leather tunic look a little more multi-dimensional. Now Gorthor Brown, this is going to be what I use to layer that dryad bark on his loincloth. Excuse me. So I'm just basically putting in, following the contours of the fur in a layer. It's long dried, it's just going on there kind of roughly. There are all these sunken pits on it, so I'm keeping this on top of the pits and trying to keep it not inside, knowing full well that I want those pockets to stay dark just to give it a good look. And I didn't do much dry brushing on this model at all, and that was okay. I like the way it turned out even without the dry brushing. But you can see his armor now that that other paint is dried. It looks we've got the foundation for some good I'll speak of the devil, grabber snakebite leather. Excuse me. So this is going on the XV88, but only on that raised shoulder pad section and down inside the guts area here. So the raised shoulder pad was XV88, and I think the inside we just did was dark oak flesh. No, I don't know. It was 2 colors back. It's like right there what I'm painting on, that kind of tan color, similar to his horns. But the snakebite leather on those 2 colors is going to look different, because the shoulder pad is the more yellowy XV88, and that's the more tan brown. So even though it's the same contrast paint, when it's finished, they will definitely look different. And then I'll use yet a third on top of the straps to give us 3 distinct leather colors. I'm pushing it down in between those straps, anywhere where there's... Okay, now Gorgunta fur, and we're cutting it with technical contrast medium. All contrast medium is thick water. If you have budget, you can use water, but I'm thinning this contrast paint. I know Gorgunta fur's got a nice red to it, and I wanted that for his horns on top of this, but I didn't want it to be straight, because if I had just used straight Gorgunta fur on those horns, see how it kind of came out a little more red orangey and not nearly as dark? That's what the contrast medium is for. It thins your contrast paint. It just basically adds less or whatever the substrate is without the pigment. So you can put it on and you can push it around and make sure you don't have big puddles settling on those keratin kind of ridges on the horns. Suck up any extra so you don't have these big blotchy pools. But now I'm left with nice orangey red horns. Now we're on to Guilliman Flesh, again cut with the same contrast medium. This will bring out some of the bone color in his shoulder. I don't know if that's a Loxodon skull, a big elephant man, or if it's just from a big mammoth. Pretty cool shoulder armament. I'm just putting it on the skull, not the horns, because we're going to do those tusks a different color. But we're also going to use that on his face. His face was way too monotone. I didn't get the, when I painted it with the airbrush. I wasn't planning on doing his whole body, we'll get to that later, but his face I was. But I used the cut version of it because I didn't want it to go on too strong and block out anything from my airbrush of the skin. So now we're on to Mechanist Standard Gray. I'm going to hit each one of these little rock stone pellets and paint it carefully not to hit my snakebite leather underneath. And I'm coming back at that with a layer as well later for some detail. Not metallic, I didn't want it to be metallic, it's very primal. Now Cygor Brown is the contrast paint, and this is straight, not cut. I'm using this for all the thick straps, as you can see. It looks black. Anywhere where there's a raised strap, gently apply some Cygor Brown on top of that XV88. And what's going to happen is, it's already a dark brown, but it is a little transparent, and the underneath, that yellowy baby puke brown or baby poop brown is going to shine through just enough to make it look like a dark leather strap, as opposed to a snakebite leather, which has an orangey look to it. So with Cygor brown on the straps, snakebite leather on top of that one color in the center, and then snakebite leather on top of XV88 on the pauldron, you got 3 distinct leather looking colors that all kind of blend together in a nice way, I think. I'd encourage you to play around with the different browns in the contrast line, as well as the bases that are brown when doing leather. It's easy to always do snakebite leather on things, but then everything you make looks like orangey leather, and you can have a lot more fun when you play around with the different depths of brown and the different darknesses. So here we are, Cygor brown. While it's out, I've got all these little pockets in there of his loincloth, and while they are still dryad bark, I thought let's add a little bit of Cygor brown to them to darken them up even more, because you can tell they look flat. By putting this on them, it darkens them to almost like there's a shadowy void inside there, and that's what I did. Now for these bands though, I didn't want them to be more dark. I used the same cut Gulliman flesh that I used for his face and the skull on his shoulder, because I wanted to keep them a bit lighter. But I think I correct that later and go over the same. Now, Gorgonta fur, this is his log, okay? Now, what color are you using? Gorgonta, that's the same as his horns on Borborygmos, but it's not cut. So it goes on much darker. And of course, I primed that log using that off-white from Vallejo. So the Gorgonta, look at how much more orangey it is than his horns, which take on a more brown appearance because of the underpaint on the horns is different than the Wraithbone wannabe that I used for his log. Now we're using the Gorgonta first. So here we go. You got this guy with this beautiful flesh I airbrushed, but it's so smooth and soft like a baby. So I load my brush with Gorgonta fur, and I flick it using my finger, making a mess, and flick it like blood flukes, to make like little moles and little maybe flecks of dirt. You can see a couple on his shoulder there. I was really happy with the way this worked out. I got a little too zealous in some spots, and I would have probably done that again if I could. Use Shabti bone on the tusks of this skull, which I'm going to hit later with a shade or a wash. But now that the flecks are done, you can just see already the skin looks a lot more realistic with moles and pocks. It's time to brush his Wazdaka red, since he is red-headed, and that squig orange we put on earlier is dry. A light, gentle, it's not dry brush, it's wet brush, but no, I don't want to push down hard. I want to leave the squig orange underneath. This is like a wet, dry brush application, and I'm not going right to the edge either, because I want it to be lighter around the pores, because as you see in a second, we're going to age this beard. Using a Jokero orange, I'm going to grab some of these strands of hair around his temples and his beard the way a man would age, where your hair goes gray at the time. Shit, I've been gray since I was like 15, but trust me, anyone out there who's listening who's not gray yet, you will be, and it's going to start at your temples, and it's going to just be these odd strands of hair. So the Jokero orange is a nice little way to show the hair is lightening in pigment. Now Wraithbone, it's not really Wraithbone, as I said, it's that off-white. The occasional, you don't go too crazy, just a few, just like that, on top of the Jokero orange to further highlight and kind of contrast those odd stray white hairs the Cyclops is getting as he ages. And looks like I'm painting Wazdaka red in his mouth as well. Now Morghast bone for his teeth. I probably would have used Wraithbone if I had liked that Vallejo paint, but Morghast bone is the answer. And actually, now that I look at it, it looks pretty white. It might be Shabti bone. It's not, I don't know if that's Morghast, to be honest. Whatever it is, I'm doing his eye as well. And I'm going to come back on the eye later. Maybe I did 2 colors. Oh yeah, so see, I said I wanted those a little darker after all, so I used Cygor brown after all. The bands just looked too they just didn't stand out enough. I know what I was trying to go for, to have a different color of leather straps, but they blended with his skin and it didn't look very good. So there we are, they're getting their own individual treatment. Again, be careful, gentle. You've got all that, oh, see, I flicked and messed up there. You've got all that nice skin. Yeah, see, it was Wraithbone I ended up using on his eye, and a little bit of one of the browns for a pupil. So now I take my Mechanis standard gray and I lighten it with a little bit of white or off-white, just to give an edging on all those little stones so they don't look so flat. and the base is going to be Meccana standard gray as well. And we're going to get into some base work soon. This is common fare. Apply it, very quickly and all over, because you're going to paint, you're going to base it up. But around his feet, be careful. Don't use a big brush. Get close, but not too close, and come back at with a little brush, like I did. I used a big brush to apply it all over put it all over areas, but then I come back with a little brush to do around the feet and the details. Well, while we're at it, let's do his axe. Using the same gray, I'm going to hit the axe. Now it's got these cool ropes that are bound on there holding the stone. The stone is a piece of masonry that a tree was growing in, and Borborygmos ripped it right out of the ground and fashioned a great axe with it. So we're going to use a standard gray, and then we're going to use a Skaven Blight Dinge to wet blend the more recessed areas of that blade. So the darker pit sections are going to get a second coat of a darker kind of a brown gray, which is Skaven Bright Dinge. And actually, I think I've been putting a light gray on top of that too. And Talaran sand is the color I'm using for the rope. Just, you've got your grays on there, so paint the rope, get right in there. Don't worry about hitting the stone, as I am. Look at how hard those are to paint, right? They're all nestled in there. You are going to hit the stone, but here's the trick. We paint from the inside out. In this case, we painted from the outside in. That's okay though. Just put your Talaran sand all over it, just like I am. And anywhere you accidentally hit the axe, you're going to go back over it with gray to touch it up. Alright? When you're done, you're going to have this cool effect that rope is really tight because the axe bites into it. So Morghast bone on these skull and bone pieces. And as I told you in the lore, they're supposed to be shields from other guilds around his wrist. They look like bones to me. In fact, I'm positive I saw a skull in there, and those are rib cages. So I think we have a disconnect from what the people at Wizkids sculpted on this guy's arm versus what he actually has on his arm. And just hitting all those details. Before I did this, I didn't catch this on film, but I used some Necron compound to dry brush on the Iron Warriors. That's why it's so shiny. And also the Iron Warriors around his bicep has some hazmat copper or hasgut copper. There's some copper paint, as well as the spikes coming out of the elephant's eyes are copper as well. Agaros dunes on this bracer to make it look a little more rusty. I know I had the Necron compound on there, but it's too shiny. This just dirties it up, makes it look a little bit more junkyard. So let's take a look at his skin. I did like the way the skin turned out. There are the splats. Splats look good. Maybe a little too zealous in there. See his bicep, his face, he's got his little people there. That's good. The horns look good. But the skin is too clean. Look at him. He's so white. It's like, those veins are cool. We could do something about that skin. Carefully. Reikland flesh shade. It's not flesh tone. It's not the contrast Reikland. It's the shader Reikland. And as soon as I did this, I was like, oh no, what have I done? Because I had that beautiful airbrushing, which did look good. I liked it. But now I'm putting this everywhere. It took a long time to do this. I didn't film the whole time. You see about a third of what I did here. I constantly pushed and pulled the little pools around to make sure they sat where I wanted them to sit. I don't want a big dark shadow under his armpit. I do want a little shadow in the small of his back and under his, his calf muscle. So I constantly added a little more and dried my brush off and sucked some of it up, and then added some more between the toes. Oh, that's too much, suck some of it up, and that's what I did. So I'm gonna just put a couple stills here of that. Take your time. You spent all that time getting that good flesh. You don't want to blotch it with a bunch of black blotches everywhere. So apply it conservatively and take your time with it, and you'll have a good finished product. Okay, onto his base. So I had this really cool idea for this base. I was like, I'm going to incorporate the Magic the Gathering card with Borborygmos. I'm going to take his base and I'm going to include a card holder, and I'm going to split the base in two sides, red and green. The red side is going to have rocks and the green side is going to have forest. So I used this construction board that I have here, and I actually painted a red side and a green side. Talk about literal, eh? So this is like warpstone green. And I don't usually paint. I'm no artist. I'm no Raquel at Rex. So I don't paint for I don't paint art. How's that? I thought I'd be artsy. And this is Mephiston red. As you guys follow these videos know, I love this red. I think they're beautiful. This is looking very Christmassy. And I've got it on there, and oh, I missed. Did you see that? I blended in the color in the can. That's okay, I fixed it later. But yeah, just there we go. I wanted to have where the two colors diverge. For those of you who aren't Magic fans, know red and green, that's Borborygmos' clan. So this is what I was left with when I was done. And I was going to base that. There was a couple problems with this. For one, it wasn't perfectly flat. It kind of rocked. 2, it looked like my 9-year-old made it. And 3, yeah, see number 2. So instead, I'm like, okay, but I love the idea of splitting, but instead of actually using literal colors, let's use an oval base that I have. That's a traced outline of where Borborygmos is going to be, and let's use that and decorate it with actual terrain. So let's do it. So first thing I'm going to do is use some gravel and get the base and the foundation of my mountain. It's important to trace out where your model is going to go so you don't block yourself into a corner. Glue the stones in the various area with the sexy glue gun. So hot. And it's going to be the foundation for a built up kind of mountain. Get some stones from your garden, go for a walk, all kinds of stones you can use. And the glue gun lets them set instantly, and you can do fun things with it. And if you make a mistake, you can bust them off and try again. Very easy. Next, Mod Podge. Fun. If you've never used it, try it. It's like white glue, but it's more liquidy. It smells like crafts from like when I was in kindergarten. I probably ate most of this stuff. Use a junky brush, put it all over the place. As you can see, this is my rocky side. And then I'm like, you know what? I might as well do them both at the same time. Wasn't a terrible mistake, but it could have been more well thought out. Because if I'm going to put grass down at the same time I'm putting rocks down, well, which one do you do first, and how do you shake it off without getting on each side? But we'll see. It worked out. So use the natural baby rocks for the mountainside to fill in the gaps around the stones that you glued in, and then you hit the grass on the grass side. Now, what's that space up top? Well, we know that's for the model. What's the space on the bottom? Well, that's for the magic card. So using some spring undergrowth and some poly grass, mix it together and then just sprinkle it all on there. And yeah, that stuff. Scatter foliage. This. I don't have my static grass applicator does not work very well. I bought a knockoff one. I wouldn't have suggested it. So I turn it and tap it upside down. Now I glue Borborygmos in place with crazy glue, and I'm dry brushing with Dawnstone onto his base. And then I'm putting a couple different other contrasting growthy colors with some glue so it's not so green. And we're gonna get some twigs up in there. Alright, you can make little trees out of twigs, especially to scale. I mean, each one of those would be like the size of a tree. Hide the gluey base using some of that stuff. Put a log down. It's your forest base, bro. You can do it. Use the hot glue for instant setting. So as I was saying, I don't have a very good static grass applicator, so I do a lot of gluing it on, turning the thing upside down and tap, 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 tap. Hopefully gravity pulls them all the right way. I had this cool idea at this point to put a boulder in place on top of those, which I did. Now, leaf litter, if you're going to buy anything from Green Stuff World, those leaf litters are great. Leaf litter, fake moss, the leaf litter I've made ivy with, fake moss, summer undergrowth. I mix it all together because it's a forest, bro. It's going to look good. Now, for my lit freehand skill, I'm actually going to paint on that boulder. Yeah, badass freehand work by yours truly. I'm painting freehand the Gruul symbol on that boulder. And I don't do much freehand. You saw my artwork earlier, but I did okay. It was passable. Hence why that boulder worked out so well. See the moss beside it, where some of the green creeps into the mountainy area, and some of the stones are in the green area. Ooh, I was really happy. I think this turned out really cool. And that extra space on the bottom and the front, that's just for the card. But I got rid of the hard plastic shell idea because it wasn't needed. The card's not like, it's not worth $1 million and I'm gonna keep it. And instead I just used some sticky tack to stick the card in place. And Borborygmos enraged. There he is in his finished beauty. I like his auburn eye. He's very shiny. I used a semi-gloss semi-gloss sealer on him, because this is going to be on display in my friendly local gaming store, and if anyone touches him, I don't want the paint to scrape off with simple handling. The basing isn't going anywhere. It's locked in with Mod Podge and glue and hot glue. But if you scraped him or picked him up, he could scuffle. See his skin, different tones, and the Reikland flesh shade, which brought out some of the elements, and you can still see the spackles. Not my best. I mean, it's not the best skin work. Again, not winning any awards, but conceptually, it's there, and story-wise, it's great to tell that story. And there's the card, Borborygmos Enraged. It's the same pose. How cool, right? There's his finished Loxodon skull on his shoulder. Love it. Bracer. Here's the backside view of the moss running up that tree. I would love doing bases, and you should too. It's fun. You can do whatever you want. Anyways, that's 30 minutes. If you were painting along with this or just listening, I hope my voice gave you some good ASMR vibes. Otherwise, please like, share this video content, comment below what you like, what you don't like. I like to hear from you, and I'll respond to all of you. As always, I'm GMA Tank. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Wash your hands, people.